Welcome. I'm Amanda Ghanooni from Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs in New York City. We hope this finds you and your loved ones safe and healthy. During these unprecedented times, we know it is important to continue the mission of the Council, providing a forum on pressing ethical issues confronting our world. Carnegie New Leaders, a program based at Carnegie Council, was created to connect early and mid-career professionals from all work sectors to that guiding mission and examine the ongoing topics of our generation. Through these conversations with leading experts, we have addressed issues of climate change, artificial intelligence, mass surveillance, migration, and many critical issues in foreign policy. Our focus is always to use ethics as a lens to this investigation. Like most of our peer organizations and friends, we prefer in-person events, but we are glad you joined us here on Zoom this evening. Tonight's format will be 30 to 35 minutes of moderated discussion and 30 minutes of Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question to our panelists, please use the chat feature, and my colleague Alex will present that to the panelists. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Sam Jordan. She is the president of Carnegie New Leaders Carnegie New Leaders DC chapter and a member of the Advisory Council leadership team. She is also a client leader at IBM. In her role, she oversees the adoption of agile techniques and IT modernization efforts. Previously, she was at the Regulatory Economics Group, LLC, and an economic litigation consulting firm. So thank you so much. And at this point, I'd like to hand this over to her in Washington, D.C.
Well, great. Thanks, Amanda. I appreciate it. As Amanda just said, my name is Sam Jordan. I'm the president of the Carnegie New Leaders in Washington, D.C. And before we get into this discussion and I introduce our panelists, I do want to provide a bit of a backdrop to this discussion. If you're like me, you are experiencing a little bit of COVID-19 fatigue, since we're all responsible people well-versed in the current crisis. But I did want to provide a bit of a backdrop from an ethical lens, since we are the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. And this is truly an international affair, right? So 538 presented a poll on April 16th that showed on average, 56% of Americans said they were at least somewhat confident in the government on coronavirus. But given that the term government is all-encompassing, so it incorporates multiple individuals, different entities, different organizations, it is important to break that down. And in the same article, 538 showed Americans overwhelmingly have confidence in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, while only 23% said they have high levels of trust in what the president is telling the public. So Dan and Mei, given that the media is the conduit through which we, the public, receive information from both the CDC and the Trump administration on matters of our personal and public safety, I think it's incredibly important to evaluate the relationship between the media, government, and the public through this ethical lens. So given that, we're gonna move to introducing our panelists who will be assisting me with this discussion. So first we have Daniel Lippman, who is a reporter covering the White House and Washington for Politico. He was previously co-author of Politico's playbook. So if you're like me, that is something that you read almost every morning. So we have Daniel to thank partially for that. We also have Mei Fong of the Center for Public Integrity, where she is the Director of Communications and Strategy. It'll become very apparent quickly why we invited Mei to this panel. Mei is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for international reporting. So when there was tightening of censorship that led to a scrapping of a Chinese edition of Mei's book on one-child policy in China, Mei released a free digital version in Chinese, paying for it through an innovative crowdfunding initiative. So her efforts led her to being named a top 50 influencer on US-China relations by Foreign Policy magazine. So as you'll see, we are in very good hands for this discussion, a lot of expertise here. So to start, what I'll do is I'll give both Daniel and Mei about 2 minutes to discuss how COVID-19 has affected their role and the way in which they cover the news. So we'll go ahead and start with you, Daniel. How has this current crisis affected your role in the way in which you cover news?
Thanks so much for having me, Sam. I'm honored to be here. In terms of how my role has been affected, like I've never been busier with my job because this is kind of a 9/11 type emergency where it's all encompassing. There's basically no other news to cover since it's hitting every part of our society in terms of the government response to try to prevent a Great Depression, and the government health response, which has been heavily criticized as being short on the uptake. In terms of how it's affected my job, like I can't see most sources face to face, and so most of my time is spent pacing in my apartment on the phone, trying to get information from sources. We have a weekly Zoom meeting with my White House team members, but you can't minimize the creativity that you can just get by swinging by a colleague's desk and finding out what they're working on, and having those chance encounters in a newsroom that is particularly helpful. But I also often go to DC parties when there is a party season, which we're probably not going to see until after a vaccine, and so I get tips there. And without that, I'm sure there are stories I'm missing. But I also feel kind of grateful that I'm in a role where we're known as essential workers, and so I've gone to the White House to cover some of those briefings, and I think our role is to get important information out there and to hold people accountable. But it's also hard for other news that's still happening around the world to actually get published.
Thanks, Daniel. And Mei?
Well, my role's a little bit less glamorous than Dan's, a whole lot less partying. But so I come at this from two positions, which are slightly schizophrenic. So I'll sort of explain. So right now, I run strategy for the Center for Public Integrity. It's one of America's oldest Pulitzer Prize-winning nonprofit newsrooms. And we're also based in DC, and our whole thing is investigative journalism, long form, deep dives. We never met a foil we didn't like. Our whole role is to sort of explain how government works and what's been the policies and how this translates to people, regular folks living in the rest of America. And so part of my role involves making sure not only that we cover really interesting projects, but also making sure that we have the funding for it and sort of, helping with the revenue and fundraising. So one of the things, if you're going to really talk about how COVID-19 is really affecting journalism and our day to day, is the very fact of the matter is it's going to hit our funding revenue. Journalism is expensive. And I'll give you one statistic there that is very sobering. There's something like 35,000 newsroom employees now. And that number is obviously going to go down as COVID-19 hits, as ads go, events go. We're nonprofit, but we will still be affected. And 35,000 newsroom employees it's considerably less than the number of people who are actually killed by COVID-19 fatalities in America. Which is right now, I think, over 45,000, almost 50. And while one is definitely going to go up, the number of news reporters is definitely going to go down. So, what does this mean is, as at a time when we are, truth is a big casualty in this, when we need more fact-based journalism than ever before, you're going to see fewer people being able to do this. And moreover, do deep dives into the very expensive journalism that takes very long range, very ambitious projects. That is one big concern. Now, in my other role, in my other sort of previous incarnation, where I covered, foreign correspondence, I was a China correspondent. And what I see there is another big problem where journalists are unfortunately also sandwiched. In one case, in the previous, I talked about how it's being hit by market forces, right? And this other one is basically bilateral issues. US and China are two global superpowers now, vying for the world stage. The coronavirus, who handles it better, who caused it, the two narratives of whether an authoritarian regime can manage this better versus a democratic process, all this means that journalists are caught in the middle. And what we definitely see that was with the expulsion of a whole host of U.S. journalists from the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal for basically doing their jobs. And again, that's another big issue, right? What happened in China with COVID-19 is still a story that's still unfolding, and now we have less reporting and less knowledge on that. So these are the two sort of big issues that I see as things that are affecting journalists domestically and internationally. We are more important than ever before, but the forces that we face are much more challenging.
Thank you, Mei. I will certainly follow up and ask more questions on the expulsion of journalists and how you think that has impacted this current crisis. But before we do that, I did want to remind the folks that are listening that you can post your questions in the chat. And once we finish our moderated discussion, we will get to those answers. And so Alex will be fielding those questions for us. So just, if you do have a question, go ahead and pop it in the chat and we'll get to it. The first question that I have for both you, Daniel and Mei, is how might a lack of public trust in media and government affect the public's response to the COVID-19 crisis? And Daniel, since you went first last time, Mei, I'll let you go first this time.
Well, this is a big problem, right? Who distinguishes who are the truth tellers from who are not the truth tellers now? And that's a part, where I'm thinking to some degree, unfortunately, media organizations or even Facebook and all these other places are big problems because, for example, Facebook, even before COVID-19 had all these issues with them agreeing to do ads where they would monitor, political ads, where they wouldn't monitor truth telling or anything in the whole process. So then that's a proliferation of fake news, and that's being confused by real news. I mean, if you want to take a sort of a filter and look at things, why is it that all the free news is all the stuff that you're going to see about celebrity stuff and rubbish, whereas the real deeply reported stuff, most of it is paywalled. You have to pay for it, and increasingly people can't distinguish. I'd rather go for the freebie than not, especially now when people are belt tightening. And that's been an issue, right? We have all sorts of rumors that arrive, and it doesn't help if the person in the White House also sometimes propagate some of that. Bleach, Lysol, anti-malarial drugs, are they all the new, and so this is the problem because we don't have old standards anymore. This is what we take as everything is increasingly polarized. And I don't know what the answer to that is, except for maybe people to sort of recognize that when you want news, you kind of have to pay for it. It's never free, not good news.
Thank you, Mei. Daniel, would you like to respond?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's profound effects on most Americans in terms of believing the truth, and they see a president who the Times just did an analysis where they looked at all of his briefings, and he's self-congratulated himself 600 times. And so they're looking at people like Tony Fauci and Deborah Birx of the task force, who are government scientists and are playing a big role. They're worried when Trump said on Twitter, or he retweeted a Fire Fauci theme. They also look at how the CDC has recommended people to wear masks in public, but Trump said he wouldn't follow that recommendation, which is his own government CDC. And you saw Pence today not do that when he toured the Mayo Clinic, even though the Mayo Clinic requires outside visitors to wear a mask, even if they get tested regularly, like Pence. And so it's hard for, most Americans, I think, will follow that advice, but you're already seeing some people move around a little bit more. There was a study looking at cell phone data, from millions of cell phones, and more people are not staying at home, they're not social distancing, even though those guidelines are still in effect. And so that has real world health consequences, especially as governors start to reopen. And I think there is an effect on public discourse and how people actually respond to public health advice when you have the two most powerful people in the country in different ways saying that those recommendations are, should not be followed in some ways. And so, and I think that just is compounded based on all of the criticism that Trump has made of media in the last few years, where many Americans don't trust anonymous sources, and Trump has fed that distrust. Even though I can't do my job without anonymous sources, because most people, if I'm working on an investigative piece and I'm talking to people in the government who are kind of whistleblower types, giving me confidential information that they shouldn't be doing, which is violating their own agency policies, they can't have their name attached to it. And so I have to protect them. And of course, I'm going to check out their information, but people are sometimes saying, who are their sources? Trump has called me fake news for pieces I've done, although not during this crisis, but in the past during his presidency.
But I should also add to that, Dan, which is this. Aside from anonymous sources, one of the other ways that we have always been an important toolkit for journalists is the Freedom of Information Act and Freedom of Information Act requests. And one of the problems with COVID-19 is that many agencies have actually taken this opportunity to sort of limit that access. So for example, the FBI now says, we won't take any FOIA requests that don't come by mail. We won't take any electronic requests, which makes no sense whatsoever, because why would you want not encourage people to do it by electronic means versus going out and mingling and whatever. State Department also not doing any FOIA requests now, and many other places. And some of it is legitimately because, of course, many city governments and so on are swamped right now. But there are some real concerns that this is, again, another clampdown on transparency. And that's never good, because right now, of course, we really, really do need to know who knew when this was going down, what they could have done and what they could not have done. And FOIA requests have been the key to unlocking many of these stories. So we need it.
Thank you, Mei and Daniel. That kind of sets us up nicely for the second question, and I hope that you continue to comment on transparency with this regard. What unique ethical challenges does COVID-19 present to journalists, given that the population is relying on the media for information that's concerning matters of public safety? These are questions of life and death in some cases. So we'll start with Daniel.
Sure. So I think it's a very good question, because sometimes when you're a journalist, you're just thinking about the next story. You're not actually thinking, is this an ethical story? Is this something that, is good for the greater good? And so I think one thing the media has wrestled with is how much airtime to give those briefings, especially since there's a lot of misinformation and people don't trust what those briefings say. And what Trump says during them. And so should CNN and MSNBC air them in full, or should people just watch on C-SPAN or on the White House's website if they really want to tune in? Even a few days ago, you had the Trump press office try to put CNN in the back and move up a pool reporter, a non-CNN reporter, to a prime seat in the front. And so this is kind of a way to punish CNN for asking tough questions. And I think, if I looked at some of the stories that I've done recently in terms of thinking about them in an ethical lens, and I think the work that many journalists have done in the last month or two to hold the government accountable, that's incredibly ethical, because people who did not prepare well enough for this crisis, whether they're in the federal government, even in the former administration, the Obama administration, or among governors, and especially in the Trump administration at HHS, the history book should reflect that fact when they didn't, have enough tests, and the strategic national stockpile, which is set up for an emergency like this, doesn't actually have enough ventilators, and there's not enough masks, and we've outsourced all of our, PPE production to China. And so that has led to thousands of deaths, and prioritizing what economic experts wanted in New York City, for example. So Bill de Blasio, if they had shut down New York 1 or 2 weeks earlier, they might have had 80% fewer deaths. And de Blasio, even after what happened in Washington State, he was saying, hey, it's fine to go out, don't change your, stay in, continue to support the economy. And, so some of my stories that I've done in the last few weeks, they looked at how DHS, they stopped doing pandemic modeling a couple of years ago, which is, DHS wasn't very happy with that story, because I was pointing out maybe that was not a wise decision, especially when you had Alex Azar, the HHS secretary, say that was something that kept him up at night. And then the Trump team, they used one of their top economists in the White House, who had received, whose think tank had received $1 million from United Health. Of course, he is working to oversee United Health as they dole out billions of dollars at HHS. And so I don't think that guy is going to talk to me anymore. And then one more final story that I think has an ethical angle is during the transition, the Trump administration, the senior leaders, they were given a briefing by the Obama folks, and one of those was that there could be a pandemic, the worst influenza outbreak since 1918. That was on their packets that they got, and some of them were not paying attention. They didn't actually read the materials properly. They kind of just sat in the meeting. Wilbur Ross fell asleep a couple times, and so that is, you have to do that journalism now as that stuff is fresh and current. And of course, there's probably going to be a commission, a blue ribbon commission, that looks at all the shortfalls, but they'll be looking at stories that my colleagues and I are doing to try to put that report together.
Thanks, Daniel. Mei?
Well, I think one of the big ethical considerations journalists will have in covering the pandemic is, COVID-19 is like one of those magic markers that you take that sharply outlines this massive inequality that's in the society, right? So suddenly now we can see where the vulnerable populations are that are most hit by this. You might say, a virus hits everyone equal opportunity, but that's not necessarily true. It seems to, it has a much more stronger effect on people who have less health coverage, who are in more areas which are more vulnerable. There's plenty of data now showing how it's disproportionately affecting Blacks and Hispanics. And also, I think one of the very interesting ethical quandaries that's raised is, what do you even call it? Do you call it the Wuhan virus? Do you call it the Chinese virus? Which is, I think, one of the things. One of the stories we just ran today for the Center of Public Integrity was a poll that we showed that more than 30% of all Americans have actually witnessed, incidences of hostility towards Asian Americans during this whole COVID-19 pandemic. And that, I think, is, very strongly correlated to what it's being called. And when we ran that story, a lot, some people are like, well, it did originate in China, this didn't happen in some alpine village. Why shouldn't we call it the Chinese coronavirus? But, there are all sorts of ethical considerations there. One, scapegoating. Two, there's a differentiation between China, the nation, and people who are Chinese like me, but not China from PRC. Three, there's very strong correlation between incitement of violence. One of our stories we showed, right after Trump started calling it the Chinese virus, I think it was March 16, there was a sharp spike in calls to depression, anxiety sites from people identifying as Asians. Words lead to actions. Now, what does this mean for journalists? ethically, do we ourselves, there are all sorts of guidelines on that. And it translates not just into what you call the virus, but also how you portray groups. I think for a while, a lot of newspapers were dinged because they were showing photos of the coronavirus. And I remember seeing one in The Guardian where they were talking about the coronavirus hitting Barcelona, but the picture was all Asian people in mass. So those are issues that you need to think about, because there are vulnerable populations at stake here with this virus. Not everybody's going to be hit equally, and you have to ask yourself, when you cover this, are you covering this fairly? Are you covering this accurately?
Thank you, Mei. Yeah, the scapegoating that you mentioned, it reminds me of the yellow fever, right? When the yellow fever came to the United States, it was first called the Irish fever. So it's certainly a trend that the United States has in naming things from their origin, and doing that in a discriminatory way. So thank you for bringing that up. To stay kind of on this theme, mentioning Wuhan, and the fact that the coronavirus originated in China. So far we've spoken a lot about the public's trust in the US government, but we haven't really delved into China. So Mei, given your experience with China and censorship, I'm curious if you could elaborate on what you think the effects are to this crisis of China's expulsion of Western journalists.
Well, unfortunately, journalists have become a sort of a byproduct of this tit for tat issue between U.S. and China that has been going on for some time. And so the whole reason for the expulsion, it didn't happen in a vacuum. So at one point, I think it began when China had designated the U.S. had designated Chinese reporters here working for outlets like CGT and CCTV as foreign missions and required them to register as foreign entities. And then that led to the China bouncing out several Wall Street Journal reporters, supposedly over an op-ed, which, by the way, had a very racist headline. It was called "Is China the Sick Man of Asia?" Has very racist connotations in Asia. But that was just an excuse, I think it was seen as. And then at some point, the U.S. Also had some issues with pulling back some of these visas for Chinese journalists in the U.S., and that led to the expulsion of the journalists from the U.S. Now, what does all this back and forth mean? I mean, I think that in some sense, this stems back from some policies with regards to treatment of China now. We seem to have a very hawkish White House with regards to treating China as the enemy and as a hostile force that will be increasingly needed to be contended with and contained, whether it be everything from 5G and Huawei to, green card issues, visas and spying and but the problem with that, of course, is that the journalists who actually work for U.S. entities are not, agents of the U.S. government. And that's a distinction that is a problem, because we have actually had some of our best reporting and our best knowledge of what's going on in China from these guys. And now we don't have them anymore. And what we sacrifice for that in exchange is maybe withdrawing some visas from Chinese journalists here who suddenly weren't making as much of an impact in terms of the newsworthiness. So I think we have lost out. The world has lost out, because we don't know what's going on now. For example, Chinese casualties now, China claims that the number of people killed by coronavirus is like 5,000. We've got like 50,000 here. Which one has the bigger population? What's not being told there? These are all questions that we need to be well investigated by the smartest and the brightest and the most well-trained. And now we don't have them anymore.
Right. Daniel, do you want to respond? And if not, I do have another question queued up for you.
Yeah, one thing I would say is that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, he actually did say he almost apologized. He said that he got it wrong and that they didn't expect the expulsion of those requiring Chinese journalists in the U.S. to register as foreign agents, that he didn't think that it would lead to the those expulsions of Western journalists in China. So he's like never said he got anything wrong. And so that was pretty interesting that he admitted that on a call with, the top editors or publishers of the three major papers, the Post, the Times, and the Journal. And it was on a track where they basically kind of forgot that we had a coronavirus pandemic happening in the States and around the world. The timing was very poor. Maybe, do it after this is all over if you really want to kind of poke the bear, but this was just incredibly, ill thought by the government because, we need accurate information from China. And, oftentimes what reporters write on foreign countries is actually better than the intelligence agents that we have in those countries. And so, and what they produce, which is for a very limited audience. And so, the U.S. government is kind of shooting itself in the foot in terms of actually holding China accountable. Shouldn't we keep those journalists? Shouldn't we have, do everything we can to keep Western journalists who are holding China to account for mistakes and for government cover-ups in China, or should we be lackadaisical in our, actually thinking properly about how to handle this?
Yeah, and I'll just bounce back with one quick thing before we proceed on, Sam, and that's this. I mean, this whoops, my bad, could have been foreseen entirely because, they have not had a proper, well-equipped State Department with, very smart, they've just basically decimated the ranks with, smart career diplomats who really knew the stuff. And we know this in a variety, not just China, clearly with what happened with Ukraine and many other places. They aren't listening. They don't have the expertise. They've cut down on that. And this is the direct result of it. So anyway. Sam.
Yeah, no, that was good. Thank you, Mei. The last question that I have, and this is one for Daniel, but of course, Mei are welcome to comment. Since you have attended some White House briefings in person, I'm curious what you think the effect will be of Trump announcing that they're going to be dialing back on these briefings. They'll be having them less frequently and for shorter periods of time. So we won't see these 4-hour briefings every day like we have in the past couple weeks.
No, I think it's, they're going to shift to reopening the economy and kind of putting economic experts like Larry Kudlow and Steven Mnuchin on TV much more than having Trump pontificate. But he definitely wants to travel the country more. And in terms of how they're not going to have those briefings, I think he's watched his poll numbers just, decline a little bit. And because of, losing the support of Americans who had given him the benefit of the doubt or who had voted for him last time around, but then seeing how he's handled this crisis and where his own White House aides are worried that, it kind of becomes all about him and not about the people suffering. And there's not that many remarks he makes on, giving sympathy to victims and to, it's more about self-centered praise. And so I think it might be a little too late to actually stop the damage that's been done to his credibility. He can't just unwind and forget that he's had these briefings because it kind of has defined the response to this crisis. And when you have like an hour to prepare and then you have 2 hours for the briefing, like almost every day, then how much time do they actually have in the White House for responding to this crisis and making sure we have enough tests and figuring out the swabs and everything like that? And so I think Trump has come to realize some of his shortfalls there, but he can't help himself. He's a TV star, and so he loves to be on camera, and he's watching TV all the time, and so he wants to weigh in and give this story.
I have a quick question follow up to that, Dan, which is, do you know how many media outlets actually show him unfiltered in these briefings versus how many that actually do? Is it like a 50-50 spread, 60-40? How does it work like?
I think it depends. I think Fox News always carries him, which is not a surprise, and OAN, which is his favorite new outlet on the right. And I think CNN and MSNBC, they do sometimes. I don't actually watch much TV myself, and so I'm not really monitoring on a split screen.
Does Politico filter? You guys filter, right?
Um, I think you're able to watch on, there's probably a banner that we put on our homepage, but it doesn't like occupy the page. You have to click on a link to actually watch it. But I think we always have a reporter either covering it there or watching it, and there's often news that comes out, but oftentimes it's just him stating the same talking points over and over.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mei and Daniel. I think now, since we have about 25 minutes, we will turn to audience questions. So Alex, I know that you have had a couple questions your way. If you'd like to start with the first one.
Sure, thanks, Sam. So actually, I'm going to start with a question we got over email earlier this afternoon. Just taking that one first. It's from Shayla Bolger. Apologize if I got that wrong. How can/do journalists consider public safety, both in a mental and physical sense, when deciding what information to report and how to report it in the times of COVID-19? And that's for both panelists.
Okay, let's start with Mei.
Well, just on a very specific level, I think one of the sort of guidelines that we've made clear is with regards to public safety issues, you do have to sort of consider vulnerable populations. So, for example, with regards to identities of COVID sufferers or victims or recoverers, that's something that you have to clear with them. Don't out people. They may not want to be outed as having had or recovered from COVID-19. That's a very basic rule. The other one is, I think, and this is a judgment call, right? In terms of the day-to-day things you write about, should you use this picture? When you do this, are you being sensitive to a particular population? And I think those are all still issues that are sort of probably amplified because we're doing this all the time now with the press of news. I'm not saying we didn't do them in the past. We just have way more of that now. I mean, like we used to have all these long discussions about style and all, like, you don't use the word poor, you use the word impoverished or poverty, things like that. And then, so now we're just having them all the time because all this is happening so often. So that's my experience. What about you, Dan?
I think in terms of public safety, the New York Times, they launched a new section called At Home. And so I think there's been so many stories about, oh, what can you do with your free time? And, everyone's picking up baking and, they're binging on Netflix. And I think even though those stories are worthwhile and they add to kind of the public discourse, and they make people feel a little less alone, that they're not the only person who's baking a banana bread every week, but it also goes along with the government's efforts to say, hey, you should stay at home. You shouldn't be out on the street too much, and you should be very careful. And so they have articles like how to make a mask and things like that. And so that amplifies the government's message and the CDC to try to slow the spread. And so I think that's an important thing to do. There's been some stories about people flouting those rules, going on golf courses and having small dinner parties, and you don't want to give people ideas, but they're already going to think about stuff like that. So it's not like it's a huge violation, and you're almost you're holding those people accountable and saying, hey, should you really, can't you wait a month to have too many people in your home? And so I found it interesting how the DC police has handled this. I called them up and I asked them this was a few weeks ago, how many citations they've given to businesses for violating the stay-at-home, shutdown order, and it was only like a couple dozen. And so most people are compliant, and they're not actually giving out many citations to individuals. And so it's basically a trust issue where we're kind of because the U.S. is a very individualistic society, people don't want to be told what to do, but here everyone kind of has to stay as much at home as they can, and then we can get our full liberty back after this is over. And even then, we're not going to have big, large public gatherings until after there's a vaccine that everyone's taken.
I think I want to jump in on one point with the public safety, which is where journalists really play a really important role, and that's in reporting out some of these stories about, as we go on and as we think about cures or vaccines or things like that. I think having good reporting that's fact-based by reporters who are well-trained, especially in evaluating and writing, science reporters basically, is super, super important. I mean, we can really talk about real public service that journalists did when President Trump was talking up all these anti-malarial lupus drugs, was to really look at all these studies that sort of basically say, well, hang on a minute here, there are all sorts of issues here. It's not been proven to be efficacious and has all sorts of drawbacks and difficulties. And we're going to need more of that going along, because Lord knows how long we're down in the vaccine. There's going to be a lot of stuff that's touted as a cure, as and we need better reporting of that. And science reporting is actually a real specialty. It's expensive to trade, people who are really good at it. And also the correlation between that and business reporting, because some of the reporting was also looking at how President Trump's business associates like Wilbur Ross had some financial ties to some of these drugs that were talked up. We had done some pieces in the past talking about how Trump has a history of talking up drugs and pushing them through and fast tracking them. And some of them just don't necessarily work the way they're supposed to for the things he says they are. And that's all public service journalism.
Thanks, Mei. Alex, do we have another question?
Yeah, we have a few, so I'll just go down the line. This is from Lauren Yevak to all panelists. This is a follow-up to the ethics question from earlier. She writes, sensationalism is a consistent buzzword in journalism and media. How do you think journalists are affected by sensationalism and a saturated journalism landscape focused primarily on the same topic, namely the pandemic? Is there a temptation or moral dilemma to break bad or good news swiftly and emphatically?
Let's see, I think, who did we start with last time? Did we start with Mei last time? So I think
so.
Daniel,
Or Deb?
your turn.
Yeah, it's a huge concern because journalists, we all have careers and we all want to get ahead. And so there's always the temptation to cut corners and to try to kind of break stuff before you've gotten the facts right. And a splashy headline will get you on your story linked on the Drudge Report and lots of tweets. But also, I think most journalists, they think about their credibility at the end of the day, and that if their stories don't actually bear out as being true, or they're missing large pieces, then it will hurt their career in the end. And so it's very important to not kind of get allured too much by how much social media buzz, but actually just do the best you can and fact check your stories and follow what my former colleague at the Wall Street Journal, Brody Mullins, the biggest lesson I learned was no surprises, which is that anytime you're you're doing a story, tell the subject and the target and anyone mentioned the story what you plan to report. And so for a White House piece, I'll email the White House press shop and say, hey, I plan to report X. I'm going to quote this person saying Y. And so if they have pushback, or if they want to say, hey, that's actually not true, or you should fix that before it gets published, then they have that opportunity. And so, and on very important pieces, I will print out a draft of the story and just go line by line. And I'll check mark everything that's in the story and say, hey, is this fully accurate? Read it out loud. And then I'll often have multiple things that I'll have to fix. And then when I'm done, I'll print it out again. And until there's no more fixes on, one or two times, then I'm ready for the story to get published.
Thanks, Dan, for bringing that up. I used to sweat buckets every time a story was coming out and do exactly that. But here's the thing, right? I mean, yes, sensationalism, wanting to get sexy news or a break. I mean, that's always going to be a perennial for some. But for reputable news outlets that are in it for the long haul, you want to get it right because you are the paper of record. There's a higher mission. I mean, you remember that part when I mentioned that there are 35,000 newsroom employees and there's a whole lot less than COVID fatalities? I mean, people aren't in journalism for the job security. It's not there. So most journalists, quite a lot of them, are here for the mission. Despite the crappy pay and the long hours and the career instabilities, it's still a profession that people feel that there's a mission, there's a thing you do. You are holding power to accountable. You are trying to find the truth. It's still somewhat glamorous, and that's what people go in for, and that's what people want to do. And so I think at the end of the day, and especially the ones you're going to see left standing after this whole mess, it's because they feel that they're doing some good. And so I think that's the answer to the sensationalism and all that. That's still going to be there, but there's quite a lot of people who are in this to do good.
Yeah, every day I wake up and I think, I feel lucky that I have a job where, it's very service oriented, where I'm not worried about making money or, getting profit share.
You're in journalism, you're not making money.
Yeah, for a company, I kind of trust that if I do my job, that the revenue will take care of itself, along with all my other colleagues, in terms of producing good journalism. And so, every day I'm waking up and I'm just thinking, how can I break news? What stories can I write that will actually make a difference and people will want to read and are not just like clickbait stories?
Well, as a member of the public, I am very happy to hear that the mission is still alive and well. And I'm happy to hear about the painstaking efforts that both of you take to make sure your stories are accurate. This is kind of one of those moments I wish that everyone in the United States, that this was airing on cable news so that the public could understand exactly how hardworking the journalists that are giving them this news that is so important to their lives, how hard you all work. So thank you. And Alex, we'll go to the next question.
Sure. So this question is from Jeff Schaefer. He writes, we hear that almost as an axiom that journalists should not become the story when we're talking about journalists standing up when facing unjust scrutiny or being talked down to by this administration, including Trump himself. But is that still a serviceable position given the scale and rapidity of the unprecedented challenges journalists now face in this environment? In other words, is that position actually making the problem worse?
Thank you. Mei, I think you're first now.
I mean, I think there's this, here's the thing, right? Journalists, I fundamentally do believe the story is the story. But sometimes journalists do become part of the story, and by sharing their voice and lending it, they actually give it a stronger resonance, right? I mean, I'll give you an example. Ronan Farrow, when he was covering Me Too movement, right? Part of the fact that he was persecuted, that he was bounced from NBC and all that actually made the story much more stronger. People were more interested. Not that he didn't already have a Cracker Jack story that he reported. And so in my role now, when I do strategy, when I think about how I want stories to resonate with people, sometimes it can be that the story behind a story is one reason why people want to know, So, for example, we run every week a newsletter, and we talk about some of the best investigative stories out there and how people got those stories. And that can also be compelling. We featured, for example, the guy who wrote about R. Kelly. He spent 20 years reporting the story for Chicago Tribune, and for a long time nobody believed him. But in the end of the day, and so that whole personal quest became something that was interesting. So I think that no, I don't think journalists should go to the White House and take pot shots at Trump just to get famous, but they are taking pot shots, or they're not taking pot shots, but they are asking him questions that hold him to account, and that is important. Yes.
And I sort of would add that it used to be that journalists would start their career at like a local paper, like the Arkansas Democrat Gazette or Kansas City Star, and then they would move their way up to a bigger paper and then a national paper or wire service. But now young journalists can often start their career at Politico or CNN or the New York Times, and then just continue to work at those places, because if you want to make a difference, if you want to work very hard, you for not too much pay at the start, then that's your opportunity. And so it's kind of young cheap labor, but people who are smart and driven, and they want to break news and make a difference. And so so naturally some of those people, they get noticed and they have TV contracts. And so a lot of you want to give your scoops, you want to talk about your scoops on TV. And so that's one reason why. And you also build up your Twitter followings. And so it's not a surprise that people that this is kind of a trend where you have to make your own brand to sell your journalism a little bit.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Mei. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I think we probably have time for another question before we kind of summarize and wrap this up. So Alex, do you want to go into the next question?
Sure. I'll just ask two questions, if that's okay. One is a fairly short one that might be good to close on. The first one is a little longer. So the first one is from Brett Butchness. He writes, increasingly we are faced with lesser of the two evils decisions. Example would be Doctors Fauci and Birx treading lightly not to anger Trump in order to remain in their roles, and in turn continuing to be able to provide real advice to Americans that could save lives. In their view, pandering to Trump is the lesser of two evils in order to attain a greater chance of disseminating real information. As journalists, are you facing these tough lesser of two evils decisions on how to report as well? Is it worth it, for instance, to write true but damaging stories on China if it risks hurting much needed cooperation to beat the virus and save American lives? And other question from Tina Huang, are there any ethical dilemmas that journalists face when covering the pandemic that may not be apparent to the general public?
Okay, so two questions. The first is regarding the lesser of two evils, and then the second is on ethical dilemmas that journalists face kind of behind the scenes. So Daniel, I think you're first. I've totally lost track of who's first.
So to address the two questions, I think number one, in terms of dilemmas, my editor told me, like, you only have a limited amount of time, and so you have to prioritize what where you want to make the biggest impact. And so you could spend hours on something that may not actually result from a story, or you can do something that will actually have a bigger impact, or that is more of a gettable story. And so how you spend your time is just very important as a journalist, because there's only a limited number of hours in the day. And also in terms, this just popped in my head that when I have sources that I need information from, you can't like milk them too much where it's, or you can milk them too much where it's you have to kind of tread lightly where you're not too greedy sometimes for information, or you don't call them like 5 times in one day if it's not a the world is ending story. And so you want to keep your powder dry, and you want to make sure that you keep that relationship going, so that they're able to talk to you tomorrow, and that they'll take your call next week. And then what was the first question again, or what was the other question?
The first question was with regard to the lesser of two evils.
I think I don't really worry about that too much, because you can only, I don't want to have to think, oh, my story is going to hurt the U.S. government response or the U.S.-Chinese cooperation. That's kind of above my pay grade. They should figure out their response and cooperation with international allies and rivals on their own, without stories from the media affecting it too much. And so I think other countries sometimes don't, and especially China, they don't understand that that the media is not controlled by the government, where we shouldn't have to worry about cooperation. We kind of stick to our lane, which is reporting fair and accurately and unbiased information, and then the government officials can deal with their side of the equation as well.
Thanks, Ian.
The thing I like about journalism, and this is why this is such a fascinating job, is we are both a blend of idealists and realists, right? You want to tell the truth and show injustice and be like a cape superhero, but at the same time you're gonna have to file your stories, you're gonna have to get people to talk to you, and and that's the realist part, right? So, and you constantly toggle between the two, and so it isn't, I mean, like, I'll give you an example in terms of, what we're talking about fundamentally is access, right? How much do you trade for access versus getting the real story? And that's what's happening with Fauci and Birx. Do they, they have a platform there? Do they contradict and get that platform cut out from them? And then, have no more platform to do good? But well, every time they're up there, they're standing next to somebody who's contradicting a lot of the things that they believe in and say. For China, for example, I'll give you an example. Bloomberg, a couple of years ago, decided to kill the story that they had a long investigation into the finances of China's leaders and some of the dodgy involvements there. And they decided very firmly to kill that, because they knew that this would imperil the business of Bloomberg terminals in China. And fast forward to now, and I don't know, they're probably sitting and thinking, hey, maybe we didn't do such a bad decision, because look at Washington Post and New York Times, all those guys, they're not in China anymore. They can't do any reporting, and that's certainly how I think Matt Winkler justified it, the greater good. And I certainly don't agree with him, but I sort of see in this context, in this point in history, why those decisions were made. And that's always going to be this toggling back and forth. How do we set our course? We want to achieve what we want to achieve, but we also recognize that there's terrific cost involved. And so that there isn't a perfect answer to this. And that's what makes this job really, really interesting and problematic and difficult, but also so exciting to talk about as well as to do.
And also, I think I would add that the, sources have motivations too. And so, sometimes I wonder why sources are giving it to me, but often I know what they, why they're doing that, because they want to make themselves look good, or they want to kind of bash their internal rival. And so sometimes I think journalists you don't want to get source captured, where you write stories that are just what your sources want. You sometimes have to, I've done stories where I knew someone and I was, the story was too good to pass up, where I knew that they would never call me back, but I had to kind of burn that bridge because I knew that the news was more important than just preserving a relationship. And so that's something that you think often, where how do I, sometimes you have to save sources from themselves, where they might out themselves, or they would, you want to kind of preserve access, but do it in a journalistically, ethically responsible way.
Yeah, or reporting in China, for example, one of the big problems we always had was sometimes by reporting something or something, you could expose people in China to a lot of severe hardship, right? Because you're a foreign journalist, worst they do is kick you out, but your sources may be put in prison or worse. And so that was always an ethical dilemma too, that you think about. Again, how do you get around it? How do you protect your sources? How do you not burn them? Like I said, this is a very interesting profession, and it's a very difficult profession. And these are the kinds of things that journalists face all the time. So #thank you journalists.
Yes, #thank you journalists, and #thank you Mei and Daniel. Sincerely, this was great, and I really appreciate you both taking the time to answer all of our questions plus some. So we really appreciate it. We have about 1 minute left, so let me just quickly announce some upcoming events. Oh, I do want to remind the audience that this event has been recorded, and you can find the transcript and podcast posted on our website, and we'll have that up shortly. The next Carnegie Council event is Prospects for Global Coordination in an Age of Pandemics and Emerging Climate Technologies with Cynthia Scharf, which is C2G's Senior Strategy Director. She will be in conversation with Joel Rosenthal tomorrow at 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern on Zoom. If you're interested in attending that, you can register on our website. So with that, that's all we got. We've got about 30 seconds left. So good timing, everyone. And thank you again for your participation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.